welcome Randy Ness, who's well known for his work on evolutionary medicine, by which I understand he asks questions about why have certain conditions, sicknesses, whatever, have evolved, and is there a Darwinian explanation of these? And if so, how does that help us find remedies or cures or ways of alleviating these problems? And he's been working in this area for a long while, and he's branching in also into evolutionary psychiatry. So my guess, Randy, is that you are asking similar Darwinian questions. But anyway, I'll be very interested to know exactly what's involved in here. Robin, could you please turn your... Hi, Robin. Could you please turn your video off and your camera off and your mic off?
I'm desperately trying to look for it. I got it.
You got it. Lovely. Thank you very much. Okay, welcome, Randy. I'm very much looking forward to your talk. There's been a lot of interest in it. So please take the floor.
Thanks so much for your invitation. Hi, everybody. How I wish I could be with you and we could talk in person. Had a wonderful year in London at UCL back quite a while ago, where a lot of these ideas got started. But I spent some time, I was grateful for this invitation because I've been giving lots of talks recently for clinical groups. And they all want to know, how can we use evolutionary ideas in practical ways right now? And this gives me a chance to go back more to roots and think about more of the fundamentals and the challenge of trying to bring a whole fundamental basic science to a field that doesn't know very much about it. And that also means I'm going to start by mea culpa. What I'm trying to do is impossible. You can't talk, in 1 hour trying to talk about how neuroscience helps psychiatry. I mean, really, you can hardly do that. And it's exactly the same for evolutionary psychiatry, except that our field is not well developed. So it's a double jeopardy. Nonetheless, I'll do my best to provide an overview and probably some controversial things that I hope will spur interest and discussion later. So what is evolutionary psychiatry? It is not a method of practice. It's only an application, a subunit of evolutionary medicine that tries to use the basic science of evolutionary biology to improve the understanding and treatment of mental disorders. Very quickly, these are the topics I'm going to go through, all highlighted in yellow so you can keep track of where we are in the presentation. First, something about psychiatry is in trouble and why. Second, the development of evolutionary medicine, a brief overview of evolutionary psychiatry, and then three things in a row where it is useful and where most of you will mostly have your interest, and that is emotional disorders, understanding individuals as individuals, capacities, relationships, and morality. And I very much enjoyed watching the presentation from your last thing by Jeff. Very, very compelling and very relevant to what we're going to talk about today, and then the future. So one, the search for brain causes is not working. Despite huge efforts by thousands of smart scientists, I looked up $4 billion are being spent every year on research on mental disorders. So why isn't that working? I began my career at the exact moment when psychiatry had its crisis. At the time, essentially every psychiatry department chairman in the world was a psychoanalyst. That was the dominant paradigm. In 1973, Rosenhan published an article in Science that probably many of you know was infamous. He sent students who pretended to have a schizophrenic kind of syndrome to emergency rooms. They were instructed to say things repeatedly like, I hear voices in my head saying, boom, thud, doom. They had standardized scripts. And they were all admitted to hospitals, and they were all kept for a week or two, and they were all discharged with the diagnosis of schizophrenia, even though they acted perfectly normal while in the hospital and took notes the whole time. So this really set the whole field of psychiatry on its heels, making it look like we were all fools. In retrospect, it turns out that that whole study was faked. There's no records, there's no IRB approval. No one actually can report that they were one of those students. It looks like he faked the whole thing, but nonetheless, a fake that was a wake-up call. But it had a huge impact immediately committees were convened, and they decided we had to change the whole field, get away from psychoanalysis, and move into a medical model. Work on the new diagnostic system started that very year. It took 7 more years before the DSM was published, which used checklists to make diagnosis reliable. And research began in earnest on brain abnormalities and to find genetic causes, with the great hopes that we'd find new treatments. What could be more noble than that? It was wonderful, still is a great vision. So what's the status of the quest? There's been vastly increased respect for psychiatry and greatly increased funding, with the promise that we're finally going to get to the root of these disorders. And gigantic advances have been made in neuroscience and the genetics for medicine in general and for mental disorders in particular. So enormous progress has come from all of this. However, it's been disappointing. We haven't found any specific causes for any major mental disorders. We haven't found new treatments as a result of this research. Diagnosis continues to be in disarray, and calls for new directions echo widely in the field. So this is not just me saying this. Alan Francis was one of the architects of the original DSM. And in 2009, he says, not even one biological test is ready for inclusion in the criteria sets of DSM-5. So again, this is the context. When everybody wrote the DSM, it was supposed to be a temporary document, holding the places until we could find specific brain lesions and causes, and those would be the ways of defining disorders, just like we identify, cancerous tissues, just like we identify multiple sclerosis. Huda Akil, my friend and colleague at University of Michigan, wrote with other people in science, including Nobel laureates. Unfortunately, there have been no major breakthroughs in the treatment of schizophrenia in the last 50 years, and no major breakthroughs in the treatment of depression in the last 20 years. Tom Insel, who ran the National Institutes of Mental Health in the USA for a long time, 2011, he says, whatever we've been doing for 5 decades, it ain't working. Maybe we just need to rethink this whole approach with no validated biomarkers and too little in the way of novel medical treatment since 1980 is try to rethink mental disorders, which you would hope would go back to the basic science that's missing, but no, rethinking mental disorders means new neuroscience approaches almost uniformly. So what we expected to find was a Modigliani with nice boxes and lines, distinct disorders with specific biomarkers caused by specific abnormalities that suggest specific treatments. I'm going to pause here and just say, I hope it still works. I mean, this is our greatest hope for finding better treatments for these dire illnesses. However, it hasn't. What we found instead is vast comorbidity. We can't even separate these disorders well. Very few specific causes found. Huge high genetic correlations between disorders. The genes that cause schizophrenia also increase rates of ADHD and autism. Great dissatisfaction with diagnosis still, and most treatments are very nonspecific. So we thought we'd get Motrian, but we ended up with seeing a Jackson Pollock. And sadly, this is one of my conclusions. A lot of my other papers in the works right now are about what I call organic complexity and tacit creationism. I mean, we're viewing the body and the mind as if they're designed with nice boxes and parts that have specific functions. And that's just not an accurate model for what we are finding. So part 2 is a little background on evolutionary medicine and where it came from. This is the field of which evolutionary psychiatry is a subcategory. I think there's a microphone that's turned on. Are other people hearing? Someone needs to turn off their microphone. Thank you very much. Okay, evolutionary medicine. And again, I'd like to emphasize that this has been a personal quest for me. I loved practicing psychiatry. It's such a privilege to have quiet time with someone, listening, trying to understand their life and their problems one by one patiently, and to create a relationship with that person. It was just such a privilege and satisfying because you can help most people. But sometimes I'd look out that window from the office and see the waiting lists in our clinic and the stories that people tell, not only about themselves, but about their relatives and everybody else. And this is the image that kept coming to my mind. It happens to be an image of the tsunami in Japan, but that's my image of what mental life is like for most people across the globe. Not most people. That most people live pretty happy, satisfied lives, remarkably. But the level of problems that people face is just absolutely overwhelming. And doing it one by one, you have to ask a larger question about why are these problems so prevalent? So for me, I was frustrated when I was a young faculty member at the University of Michigan. I didn't want to just become a neuroscientist or behaviorist or a psychoanalyst or a social theorist. I wanted to find some foundation that was solid to stand on. And I wandered over to the Museum of Natural History where I heard about a seminar about evolution and behavior. And I sat down with these scientists. I had no idea who I was meeting, and they welcomed me. And that's been my great good fortune throughout my career is some of the leading biologists in the world have been very patient with a doctor who really started off knowing nothing at all. That's a picture of Dick Alexander, who was the person who really led the charge at Michigan and guided the development of applying evolutionary ideas to behavior in general. The big thing I learned as soon as I went to the second meeting was that I had only been learning half of biology, that every trait needed two kinds of explanation. Said best by Ernst Mayr, he says you need both a proximate and an evolutionary explanation for a complete explanation, and that both are equally important. This means that essentially all medical research has only been using one half of biology. That got me reading lots of animal behavior, and I discovered there was a whole field out there that tried to understand behavior in two ways at the same time. One, what's the mechanism? And two, how does this behavior influence fitness? That is, why are brains the way they are? And this led to a more modern version of animal behavior science, which is behavioral ecology. And the big point is that we don't ask how behaviors evolve, because they don't all by themselves. It's brains that evolve. But those brains all look identical, but they're not identical. They're very slightly different because they're genetically different. And some of those individuals are going to do things that are going to result in having more offspring. And over time, brains of the whole species will become more like the brains of those individuals who ended up having more offspring. And that's the core principle for all of this. Selection inevitably shapes brains that maximize transmission of an individual's genes. So I saw that and I realized all of a sudden that this is a huge opportunity for psychiatry. I wrote an article quickly called An Evolutionary Perspective on Psychiatry. I think it's the only one I've ever submitted without the editor wanting revisions. And I almost instantly also realized that it would never accomplish anything because the idea of a psychiatrist writing about this kind of thing, everybody would say, well, that's odd. It needed a solid foundation. Also, I realized that asking these evolutionary questions about mental disorders was too far. First, we had to understand why other kinds of disorders existed. I had a long-standing interest in the evolution of aging and why natural selection wouldn't make all species live lots longer. And that led to a collaboration with George Williams. I had no idea at the time that he was one of the greatest biologists of the 20th century. He welcomed me. He had been looking for a doctor to work on a project about how natural selection might help to explain diseases. And I had been looking for an evolutionary biologist to help work on how evolution could explain diseases. So we spent a couple of months just talking, mostly by telephone, but sometimes in person, about how does breast cancer give an advantage? Why does heart attack give an advantage? Why does multiple sclerosis? How did natural selection shape these traits? And I say it that way because it reminds me to be sympathetic towards my students. Um, this was a terrible mistake. Finally, we realized after talking for some time that this was the wrong question entirely. The obvious question, how does a disease give advantages? We ask that of each other, and it's entirely wrong. It's the mistake that keeps being made in this field. We call it viewing diseases as adaptations. Diseases aren't adaptations. They're not shaped by natural selection. They don't have evolutionary explanations. But very often in evolutionary psychiatry, you see articles by very smart people saying, oh, how schizophrenia gives advantages, or why people with ADHD have advantages. I mean, this is just a fundamental, simple mistake, and how we eliminate that is we can talk about later. What evolution can explain, and this is the insight that led to progress, is that traits that make individuals in a whole species vulnerable to disease do need explanation. And bodies are so vulnerable for so many reasons. You've got to ask who designed them. Why an appendix? Ridiculous. The spine, it's not just your spine, it's everybody's spine that's designed in ways that results in back pain. And as for that narrow birth canal, it's fatal, especially before surgical interventions were possible. Why on earth such a ridiculous design when something like that would be so much better? So these are traits that make all individuals in a species vulnerable. These are a whole different kinds of question. The old questions about disease are, why did this individual get sick? What's the mechanism? What's broken? How can we fix it? The evolutionary medicine question is different. It's, why do all members of the species share traits that leave them vulnerable to disease? It's a giant shift in perspective. Medicine mainly takes a mechanics view. What's broken? How does it work? How can we fix it? But this is an engineer's point of view of asking, how did that design get there in the first place? Why wasn't it better? So this is a central insight that made evolutionary medicine take off. And there are several possible kinds of explanation. Uh, I give whole, hour-long lectures just about these categories, and I have another paper coming out this summer, revising them and trying to use them to have a rubric that can test evolutionary hypotheses, not just about mental disorders, but about all disorders. But some problems come because of things natural selection can't do. Mutations happen. Some come from living in the wrong environment, mismatch with changing environments and migration. Some comes because pathogens evolve way faster than we can. A big one and a fundamental one is that natural selection maximizes reproduction at the expense of fitness, at the expense of, robustness. Um, and trade-offs of other kinds also give benefits at the expense of robustness. And finally, and most important for psychiatry, is a lot of things that look like diseases, pain, cough, inflammation, and anxiety, are actually useful defenses. So the task for evolutionary medicine is to figure out which combination of these, and I emphasize combination because it's usually a combination, not just one, explains why we're vulnerable to a disease. So this has all grown very nicely. Evolutionary medicine is now 33 years old. Number of articles continues to increase exponentially. There is an Oxford Press Journal, Evolution, Medicine, and Public Health. Our society is having its 9th annual meeting this year in Durham, UK. EvMed Ed has lots of resources. We have a weekly or bi-weekly online journal club discussion, and there are centers for evolution and medicine all across the globe now. There are two different discoveries Darwin made. One was the unity of all life, that everything comes from a common source. And two is adaptation, why traits are so well suited to their functions. So this leads to two quite separate areas of work in evolutionary medicine. And it's the one about phylogeny that's turned out to be the most valuable, especially understanding the evolution of small things that evolve fast. Um, Antibiotic resistance, bugs evolve fast, and cells in cancers evolve fast. And you can track genetic origins of epidemics. Um, the work I've been most interested in, which is how natural selection can explain why we're vulnerable, it's not as useful as work using genomic sequencing and the like to trace origins. But I've been flabbergasted and so delighted that some areas of evolutionary medicine have become vastly practical. In our book, George Williams and I recognize that, cancer needed evolutionary explanations. How was it that cancer was prevented by mechanisms shaped by natural selection is a grand question. And since then, Mel Greaves, maybe some of you know him in London. He was at the Institute for Cancer Research. Wonderful book if you haven't seen it. But that's grown into recognition that within each malignancy are a whole bunch of cells competing with each other in somatic evolution. And those that grow the fastest, that is, those that are the worst, tend to take over. And if you use cancer chemotherapy to just trying to blast them all mindlessly without actually doing the math, you're liable to open up the ecosystem so the fastest growing ones can grow faster yet. instead of being inhibited by cells that surround them. And this has been used by Robert Gatenby as mathematical modeler to create what he calls adaptive chemotherapy, where the dose of chemotherapy is adjusted depending on the size of the tumor. And it turns out that this gives better clinical results and is now being tested in phase 3 trials for both prostate cancer and breast cancer. It's just so exciting that practical things have evolved. So all these latest advances will be talked about at the annual meeting of the Scientific Society, August 6th to 9th in Durham, UK. I think there are 4 more days that you can still submit an abstract. And you can register anytime. It's a wonderful meeting. And better yet, this year we have a special evolutionary psychiatry pre-meeting with a lot of distinguished people from around the world. I see Robin Dunbar is with us. He is going to be one of the featured presenters at that meeting. Part 3, evolutionary psychiatry overview and some research directions. So this is going to just give a quick overview of where evolutionary psychiatry fits with all of this, with a couple of research projects that are of interest, so I don't forget to talk about them later. Just so you know that evolutionary psychiatry is not just this stuff about emotions. It's also about other things. So here are some of the pioneers. Certainly John Bowlby. Again, many of you probably knew him. What a wonderful contribution he made. One of the very first people who do things was Brent Winograd. Wrote a wonderful book in 1990 called Sociobiological Psychiatry. And he was my host at a sabbatical in Stanford, where I worked on Why We Get Sick with George Williams. Also, a very early person is the editor of Ethology and Sociobiology, Michael McGuire, and he and Alfonso Torrisi later wrote Darwinian Psychiatry. John Price did wonderful research on chickens and monkeys. The book I wouldn't especially recommend. It's all based on mistakes in basic evolutionary biology, but a wonderful scholar and scientist. And Mel Connor spurred my interest dramatically with his book, The Tangled Wing. So again, I started off asking, how does this disease give advantages? And I'll remind us all once again, diseases don't give advantages. They don't have evolutionary explanations. Although even in some of those references that I just showed you, there are people suggesting how schizophrenia has got to be useful, that kind of nonsense. Very serious but common mistake. So evolutionary psychiatry is still getting started, but already it's too large to cover in any one, even in a whole day. These are some of the core references. Simon Baron-Cohen there in the UK read a wonderful edited volume. And the one on the right is especially important. This is edited by Riyad Abed and Paul St. John Smith. I mean, they're the 2 people probably doing the most to bring evolutionary psychiatry to the wider world. This is a book from the Royal College of Psychiatrists. They have a group called the Evolutionary Psychiatry Special Interest Group. I think it now has more than 2,000 members. So things are coming along quite nicely. Loss of Sadness by Jerry Wakefield and Alan Horowitz is a wonderful resource. Martin Brunn is a German who has written several books about evolution and psychiatry. This is my book from 2019, Good Reasons for Bad Feelings. It intends to be really a foundational, easy to read book about evolutionary psychiatry. And this is a new one from Henry O'Connell with clinical cases. He's from Ireland. And that's the symbol for EPSIG. EPSIG.org will take you to the website that Riyad Abed and Paul St. John Smith have started, where you can sign up for their newsletter about events in the UK and elsewhere. And this is World Psychiatry, where I published my magnum opus, way too long for most people to read it, but my overview open access about evolutionary psychiatry. So what about mental disorders? There's just a few different kinds, really. Most of them are emotional disorders. Some are behavioral disorders. A lot are cognitive and attention kinds of disorders. But we're going to talk about understanding individuals' life situations and why mental disorders genes persist. Alzheimer's disease is a mental disorder, but it's different from all the rest because we know the brain pathology. We can see plaques and tangles of amyloid beta and tau, and we know that they interact with the complement system to knock off first synapses and then whole neurons. That has led to a fabulous, huge, expensive research to try to solve this scourge of the world, especially now that the whole world is getting older. $4.42 billion have been spent developing drugs that disrupt beta amyloid deposition and synthesis. and they don't work. Actually, new ones might work somewhat in some people if you're early enough. But what a debacle this has been. Each drug costs about $1 billion to develop. And then it turns out that it's not working. How's it possible if we understand the pathophysiology correctly? Also, ApoE4 is the allele. And if you've got one copy, you're more likely to get heart disease and Alzheimer's disease. If you have two copies, Lord help you, if you're a woman at least, because you're much more likely than other people to get these diseases. Evolutionary approach asks a different question. It asks, why does amyloid beta exist at all? And it turns out that Kumar, Tanzi, and Mar's lab at Harvard have demonstrated that's quite a fine antimicrobial. Those little orange dots on the right-hand side are bits of amyloid beta surrounding strip or staph that's been injected into the brain of a mouse. The evidence on that is quite good. They still have had trouble getting funding. I mean, everybody has essentially argued that amyloid beta is a toxic byproduct. But that it's just a fundamental misunderstanding, I think, and I hope this leads to advantages. As for ApoE4, it's an allele being selected out, but slowly, and probably because it gives advantages as well as disadvantages. Ben Trumbull, who was at the center that I ran for a while at Arizona State University, has demonstrated that individuals in his population in the jungle in Bolivia who have ApoE4 have slower cognitive decline than other people instead of faster. And that's probably because most of them have infections that cause cognitive decline, and the ApoE4 minimizes the effects of those infections. Great opportunities here. Addiction is another one. One of my first articles on everything was with Kent Berridge, the expert on motivation. And the evolutionary explanation, this framework of it is pretty simple. That learning is useful. And if you put novel chemicals in directly to the brain system, it hijacks those mechanisms and it learns to go get drugs no matter what it takes. And this is a scourge of the world. I don't see any ready solution. Selection's way too slow to protect us. We can hope that someone will develop drugs that will block these kinds of learning without blocking other learning. What a terrible problem. Eating disorders, Riad Abed also has been a great leader in this. He's published articles in 1998 and continues to update them, showing the kinds of evolutionary forces that shape mating strategies and why it is that individuals care so much about the shape of the body of those individuals that they mate with, and in particular, why it's for women. That mate competition leads in modern societies to dieting, which arouses a famine response. And my take on this is that there's a positive feedback cycle that gets engaged. Attempting at controlling your eating just by stopping eating seems like a sensible thing to do to lose weight, but that arouses a famine response, which makes you, after a few days, suddenly stare at a whole loaf of bread that suddenly mysteriously disappeared, or a whole half gallon of ice cream. And that makes you feel like you've lost control and you're really going to gain weight. And what do you have to do? Well, that terrifies you, so you have to try harder. And this is a nasty feedback cycle. On top of all of that, when the body experiences intermittent exposure to famine, the baseline weight goes up. And Dan Nettle has done wonderful work on this, demonstrating that it's true not just in humans, but in other species. So the whole idea of just stopping eating to lose weight is a pretty good way to, first of all, gain weight, and second of all, get yourself into a positive feedback cycle. The schizophrenia paradox has been talked about for decades. Why is it that a disease that's 1% prevalence worldwide, very highly heritable, drastically reduces reproduction, and we can't find any common alleles? That we thought back in 2001 when we sequenced the genome that we would find the alleles and we'd be done with this. Turns out there aren't any common alleles with large effects. I responded in behavioral brain sciences to an article by Burns suggesting that it was linkage that explained it. But I just racked my brain about this for a few weeks. And finally, I thought about the cannon bones of horses and realized that when you breed a horse for speed, you get a cannon bone that's longer and thinner and lighter and more fragile. I'm not sure if you can, whoops, my pointer. So I'm not sure if you can see my pointer going. If anybody could respond and tell me if you can, that would be good. Jeff, can you see that? maybe not. In
No,
any
we
case,
can't-
as you
we
go up,
can't see your pointer, Andy.
okay, in that case, I'll just talk through it. Thank you. Reproductive success goes up as the bone length gets longer and the horses get faster and faster and faster. But at some point, the horse is really likely to break its leg. And this is a terrible problem at racetracks all around the world. Terrible problem because horses have been bred for speed at the expense of robustness. So I wrote that article on Cliffhead's fitness functions. I also made it a chapter of my book. I think this is a general possibility. And I was delighted that just last week, an article by Philip Mutterocker and Giuseppe Marilola came out in Neuroscience and Biobehavioral Reviews with a very proper modeling and review of all the evidence, suggesting that there really might be something to it. Here's how it goes. The maximum individual fitness is for individuals at that peak. And there's the distribution of individuals of the offspring of that individual who's at the peak. And guess what? Half of them are off the fitness cliff and very vulnerable to disease. Natural selection tends to push the average for the population down because half of the individuals having big problems is going to decrease gene transmission. But if you look at the distribution of those individuals, you still see about 1% off the cliff. And guess what? This is exactly what you see for the distribution of schizophrenia, autism, obsessive compulsive disorder, and many other diseases. I call these the 1% diseases. So I don't know about, I mean, I love the hypothesis. I'd like to develop it further. I'm not sure it's going to be right for schizophrenia because I'm not sure there's a single trait that's pushed to one edge. Instead, I love this work that has created I mean, there's long been speculation by Crow, especially in the UK, that the evolution of capacities for language and maybe the bicameral brain explains vulnerability to schizophrenia. But there's never been a real way to test it, just a lot of words. But these folks have been able to use new genomic techniques to test the hypothesis that about 100,000 years ago, when humans started getting into this new niche of language and social skills needed to reproduce, that some genes became disadvantageous, and that would create new selection for protective genes, and that's exactly what we see. The older genes that influence risk of schizophrenia increase the rate in the blue circle. The newer genes that decrease the rate are in the orange circle, and this has been confirmed by an article by Gonzalez et al. Just last year. Fabulous things that are possible now. On to emotional problems. First of all, quickly, it's not just your imagination and mine. They're overwhelming. Anxiety and depression are overwhelmingly the mental health problems. And it's not we're making it up. These are terrible, overwhelming problems. Alcohol, drug use, behavioral problems are second. Bipolar is next in terms of its prevalence. And only after that, schizophrenia and eating disorders. In the USA, 25% of women over 60 are on antidepressants. Whoa, what an epidemic is this? Why are emotional disorders so common? And why do painful emotions even exist? So that's the question I posed for myself. And I first started asking, what's the function of this emotion? And reading everything I could about that, and finally realized that that's not the right question, that natural selection does not shape emotions to serve specific functions. The right question is, in what situation is this emotion useful? Emotions, I think, are special states that improve coping in situations that influence fitness. I should say that a lot of people disagree with me about this, especially some emotions researchers, and I've made myself unpopular by saying that a lot of the way questions are even framed in a lot of emotional research, I think, is incorrect. So we'll have continuing discussions about that. But this is my diagram to try to illustrate that there are different basic emotions to some degree, but they overlap with each other because they all come from common origins of other emotions. They're specialized states that give selective advantages in situations that have increased fitness over our evolutionary history. Notice that there are two kinds. The green ones are positive kinds of situations that offer opportunities, and the orange ones are those that aren't so good and are painful because they're associated with threats and losses. So why Why are all emotions basically either positive or negative? It's because neutral situations don't influence fitness. So there's no need to have emotions for those. Yes, there are some things like curiosity or surprise or something that might be kind of in between, but they too somehow are liable to influence fitness in the long run. This is the most fundamental insight for psychiatrists. Negative emotions are useful if they're expressed in the right situation. At least they're useful for our genes. Risky situations, anxiety is useful there. Loss causes sadness, and sadness can be useful, although it's harder to see why. And immediately we come up with a new insight that sadness is different from low mood and depression. That's more likely to result from wasted effort and other kinds of situations. So already this kinds of thinking makes us more sophisticated. But this is also why we can't find specific brain causes for depression and other problems. It's because these are complex, interwoven brain systems that are produced by many genes and instantiated and mediated by many brain mechanisms. So here are two natural assumptions, certainly the ones I started off with, is that normal emotions should be useful, and that if you find an emotion that's useless, it's probably abnormal from an abnormal brain or at least abnormal thinking. And I've gradually come to conclude that these are both false. And this is the theme of that World Psychiatry article that I mentioned. One explanation for why emotions can be normal but useless is because of the smoke detector principle. Very simply, cheap false alarms prevent possible huge losses, which is why we put up with smoke detectors going off when we burn our toast. If you see that image, perhaps with not quite so good definition, should you run away? You have to do the math to figure it out. Um, Optimal system sensitivity can be calculated using signal detection theory, and it depends on the cost of a false alarm, the cost of not having an alarm if the lion is really there, the benefit of the response if the danger is present. We're going to assume that it completely protects you, and then the probability that the danger is really present given the intensity of the current cues. So if the predator might be present, say you hear a noise behind a rock, it's optimal to express a full-blown panic attack whenever the probability that the lion is there is greater than the cost of panic versus the cost of no panic. And if we just imagine that the cost of a false alarm and running away is 100 calories, and the cost of not having a panic is death, which is 100,000 calories, the ratio is 1,000 to 1. And when I first did the calculation, I couldn't believe the outcome. It was that it's optimal to flee whenever the probability of a lion being there is greater than 1 in 1,000. And this leads to the inescapable conclusion that 999 out of 1,000 panic attacks will be unnecessary, but from a perfectly normal system. This set me on my heels, and I've been treating panic disorder patients, dozens every week for years, but I hadn't realized that the natural selection had shaped the system so that normal systems give rise to lots of false alarms. This was immensely helpful. I got much more sympathetic to my patients after realizing this. It has much broader applications that false alarms are normal for pain, cough, fever, nausea, and also other things in the rest of medicine. This is what doctors do. We usually don't cure things. We usually relieve symptoms, but we're usually doing it so far without the fundamental theory we need to understand that. And this whole idea has major implications for psychopharmacology. A lot of times people say, oh, Dr. Nesse, you say that emotions are useful, therefore we shouldn't interfere with them. No, that's nonsense. This is what we do in medicine, is we try to interfere with and relieve suffering by blocking perfectly normal responses. So this has practical value. Once I started taking this point of view and talking about it with my patients, I became a better psychiatrist and they got better. A patient insisting on a referral to cardiology, he says, I can feel it in my heart. It's got to be my heart. And once I explained that rapid heart rate is really useful in an emergency situation, and you're having false alarms in that system, he literally said, oh, thanks. I wish someone had just explained that. I don't need you anymore. I'll come back if it keeps happening. And that wasn't very common, but about 20% of patients, just that explanation changes their framing of their symptoms in a way that's vastly relieving. Another common problem is patients reluctant to take medications because they say they want to get to the root of their panic attacks and find out these the secret cause instead of doing something simpler. They don't want to cover over the problem. And explaining to them that repeated panic attacks essentially make your inner mind feel like you're in a very dangerous environment, and blocking those attacks for a few months resets the system to make it less sensitive. They find that immensely helpful in helping them to take medication appropriately. So let's move on to something much harder. Anxiety is pretty easy to see how it's useful. It's much harder to see how low mood can be useful. I mean, lack of self-esteem and pessimism, even suicidality, and just why? How can that ever be useful? The usual approach is the medical one of asking, what's wrong with these people? How does the mood mechanism work? What causes its malfunction in some people? An evolutionary approach steps back to instead ask, why are we all vulnerable? Why do we all have a capacity for mood variation? And why is it so vulnerable to dysregulation? Lots of functions have been proposed for depression, and I think all of them contribute, all of them can be true, but gosh, I think that's the wrong question. I think emotions correspond to situations, and each of all of the different situations involves slightly different kinds of emotion. I see I'm not talking as terribly fast as I usually do, which means I'm dragging out a little bit time-wise. I'm going to go through some of these next ones a little bit fast. Optimal foraging theory is a wonderful advance from behavioral ecology based on Eric Charnow's work. And because I don't have a pointer to wiggle for you, I won't be able to explain this well, but the gist of it is that it takes a certain amount of search time to find a new patch of berries, and after that you get a lot of berries at first, and then fewer per minute, and then finally you've used them all up. And there's an optimal staying time for those patches. And if you immediately at the beginning, there's high motivation, and at the end there's low motivation. This is built in for all species, not just humans. Aphids or ladybird beetles do that, depending on how prevalent aphids are. So there's thrill of an opportunity at the beginning, then low mood helps us move on at the point where we're not getting any payoffs anymore. All of this was said very nicely by Eric Klinger back in 1975. Very sophisticated article. It should be required reading for everybody who tries to understand depression. For me, though, it was helpful in the clinic. When costs are greater than benefits for all available opportunities, the best thing to do is nothing. Don't just do something standard. Doesn't in our modern society that doesn't happen very often. It's more often that other kinds of situations arouse it. But William Blake, again, there's nothing new here really. William Blake in 1788, if you can read the yellowed print, if any could desire what he is incapable of possessing, despair must be his eternal lot. So the idea is that pursuing an unreachable goal, continuing when you're not having any success, makes ordinary low mood escalate into depression, leading to my question that my residents tell me is the most useful thing I ever taught them. Ask patients, is there something you're trying to do that you can't give up, even though it seems like you'll never succeed? And over again, ask after even an hour-long interview, that question brings up the actual problem. Of course, we're not actually, most of us, foraging for berries most of the time. We're foraging for social resources. What we want is friendship and love and sex and children, money, health, status. These are the things we're striving for, and more effort put into one of them goes to less effort put into the others. So we're now going to how do we understand an individual's motivational structure to understand why they're anxious in this situation or why they're depressed in that situation? I call this a nomothetic framework for idiographic data. Wilhelm Vollenbond in 1894 coined those terms when he took over the rectorship at the University of Strasbourg. Brilliant distinction that we need to make more of. So in medicine, most doctors ask their patients about what's going on in every system, a review of systems, even though things don't seem relevant. We can do the same thing in psychiatry. We should be doing a review of social systems, asking about all 6 of the major resources that people strive for: social, occupational, children and family, income, physical resources, abilities, appearance and health, and love and sex. The problem with life and why we lie awake at night is because any investment in any of these things is liable to take away time and effort from the other, and there's conflicts between them. And taking that new job in a distant city, what's that going to do for your spouse and your children? These are the conflicts that are constant in life. But you can get a handle on them by systematically asking in each area what the person has, what they want, what they hope for, what they fear, what are they trying to do, how do they expect it will work out, and what emotions are they feeling. This is a delicate matter. You don't go blundering in with these questions because normal people, remain wonderfully and appropriately unaware of a lot of things that they're not really pursuing very seriously. So what to do differently with these ideas? Analyze each individual situation as an individual. Don't make some blundering, gross diagnosis based on a checklist. Consider all possible causes instead of assuming that it's all genes or all environment or all early rearing. Look at top-down causes, bottom-up causes, and every which way causes. This is why we can't find the causes of depression. It's because they're all intertwined, top-down and bottom-up. And it also encourages us to use all possible treatments instead of getting stuck in just using drugs or behavior therapy or cognitive behavioral therapy or analytic therapy. On to the origins of altruism and moral passions, your topic for last week, and apparently several of you in this group are especially interested in this, and I am too. I think this is a missing foundation for understanding how relationships cause most mental problems and how psychotherapy can help cure them. And I'm going to pause here and say that I'm not at all sure that this basic science is ready for application in the clinic. It's not too complicated, but it's too controversial, and people tend to apply things in simplistic ways. So we can talk about this afterwards. The intuitively obvious answer is that altruistic tendencies that might be costly for an individual exist because they benefit groups. And the old story about lemmings is that at the end of the winter, when there's hardly any grass, a bunch of them jump into the fjords and off themselves because otherwise the whole species would go extinct because there would be no grass left. However, you see this fellow with the life preserver. Which of these lemmings is going to pass on their genes to future generations? You can see that Gary Larson has really nailed the essence of why selection for traits that harm individuals but benefit groups just doesn't work. I think his work was very intertwined with that of George Williams, my friend and partner. 1966, he wrote a book called Adaptation and Natural Selection, which is generally credited with revolutionizing our study of social relationships and animal behavior. And the essence of it was that if individuals with genes for altruism, costly things that help others but harm the self, have fewer offspring than others, then those genes for altruism will be eliminated, even if groups with more altruists do better than other groups. This is a foundational text and required reading for anyone who wants to understand evolutionary relationships. It didn't get widely recognized until similar related ideas were developed by Richard Dawkins and the selfish gene, who created a firestorm. Are we just agents of selfish genes? People worried. Is selfishness natural and unavoidable? Is genuine altruism impossible? And I was disturbed by all of these things, especially because I was working with George Williams at the time. And it fundamentally changes your view of life in ways that I think are not nice at all. I mean, I used to walk into a forest like this and just be in awe at all of those trees and standing a good distance from each other. But when you look at this from an evolutionary point of view, you realize what a waste. Why put all that effort into growing tall and all that wood when they could collect just as much light if they'd all cooperate a little bit and just grow about 2 or 3 feet tall? Why? So genes as selfish is an insight. I think it's just as threatening to our sense of self as insights from Copernicus, Darwin, and Freud. George Williams was tortured by this. He wrote a number of articles and even a book about natural selection, inevitably making things selfish. And if you thought you saw something that was altruistic, it must be just a mistake. He said they must have been produced indirectly by some sort of accident. Uh, he was tortured by this, although he was a very good man. Interesting. I was tortured by it too. I spent 2 decades literally thinking about this most nights. It first led me to do work on evolution and the capacity for commitment, based on a conference as game theory for commitment. I don't think that's as important as I had hoped it would be. But then finally, I wrote an article. My favorite title of all is "Why a Lot of People with Selfish Genes Are Pretty Nice, Except for Their Hatred of the Selfish Gene," in which I basically talk about the emotional responses people have to the idea of the selfish gene. Some people say, "I knew it all along," and other people say, "I can't believe that. That can't be right." It's fascinating, the psychological defenses aroused by that. And then finally, in 2007, I came to a solution that allowed me to sleep, and that's runaway social selection for displays of partner value. But first, I think this whole idea of selfish genes presented crudely is not just threatening, but it's a social toxin, because there's a self-fulfilling expectation. If you think everybody's selfish, you're going to act selfish, and then nobody who's generous is going to want to hang out with you, and this makes the reality of your world one where everybody is selfish. I'll go back to Hobbes, 1651. Can I read this? I've got to read this, even though we're short on time. Hobbes says, "The fool has said in his heart, there's no such thing as justice," and sometimes all through the tongue, alleging that every man's conservation contentment being committed to his own care, there could be no reason why every man might not do what he thought conduced thereto, and therefore also to make or not make, keep or not keep covenants, was not against reason, when it conduced to one's benefit. From such reasoning as this, successful wickedness hath obtained the name of virtue. I mean, that I think is the best rejoinder to crude applications of selfish gene thinking. Genes are selfish, but people aren't. People are passionately moral. They help because it's the right thing to do. They experience racking guilt and rage at violators. How could natural selection shape such traits? And again, this is condensing a 2-hour lecture into a couple of slides. Kin selection gives benefits to others who have the same genes. I expect most of you know about that. And Bill Hamilton's fabulous advance. Reciprocity is trading favors. Mutualism is things that help both individuals but look like altruism. Enforcement is crucial. Cultural group selection is real. And then there are mistakes. Most people who write about this advance just their own ideas at the expense of the others. And it's very hard to grasp how all of them can conspire in those tangles to create capacities for altruism and morality. But this is a huge accomplishment nonetheless. We really understood the origins of cooperation. It's one of the great accomplishments of the late 20th century. But also, people help kin passionately when no payoff is likely. Those are lifeboat guys who go off in the seas off the coast, I think, of Wales. Moral passions are real. How does selection shape these capacities for real motivational altruism with non-kin? Gintis points out, I'll skip this one, he says, "Hey, all these economics experiments show that Homo economist is not real. That's not what people are like." My psychiatrist perspective is neurotics are way more common. Lack of trust wrecks life. Schemas are hard to change. And again, the belief that selfish genes make selfish people is toxic. I've actually seen many people who, in my evolution and human behavior associations, who come upon this idea and they start living differently. They say, "Oh my God, I thought I should be a good person, but we're all selfish. I'm going to start. I've been a sucker." What a terrible outcome from this meme. Very quickly, this is a guy you probably all should recognize, a young man who has young man syndrome. His name is Oedipus. He kills this guy who tries to challenge him going first to the crossroads, but he's not the interesting character. Interesting one for this is Antigone. Antigone, his daughter, leads him out of the city after he's blinded and reviled by everyone. Why does she do that? Maybe because she has more than 50% of her genes with him? That's not the point. The point is that she leads him everywhere. Not only that, when her brother Patroclus dies, and she's told, "If you even try to bury him, we're going to kill you," she does it anyway. Whoa. I mean, I think these myths are so powerful because they tap into our recognition that we are moral beings, and there are challenges every time we make a moral decision. Where do they come from? I had to read Mary Jane West Eberhard's work 3 times over 10 years till I finally recognized the importance of this phrase. Sexual selection refers to the subset of social competition in which the resource is mates. Social selection is differential reproductive success, that is, gene replication, due to social competition, whatever resource. Basically, sexual selection is a subcategory of being chosen for something, and we choose social partners as well as sexual partners. Mary Jane Whittaker's word was augmented by Peter Hammerstein and Roger Noe about partner choice. The essence of this is that self-interested partner choices create selection forces that shape us all to care a whole lot what other people think about us and have traits such as generosity, empathy, honesty, loyalty, and displays of wealth and power. So this is runaway sexual selection, social selection, because the advertisements get more and more expensive because you're competing with others. Just like flowers. This phenomenon is obvious in the natural world. Why are flowers so dramatic and costly? Competition to be preferred by pollinators. Lots of people have worked on this. The mathematics is well worked out. And it creates a shift in motivation from asking, how can I get more than I give, which is the old evolutionary psychology view, to how can I get others who offer the most to choose me as a partner. And I'm going to go past a lot of these things. Robin and I have done joint presentations on related work on this. I look forward to his comments. How many friends does a person need? Well, it's as many as possible, especially those who have resources and share them selectively. So social selection shapes all of these things that are at a great cost. Social anxiety, guilt and shame, intense concern about what other people think, and ridiculous displays of wealth and power. We're running short. I'm not going to talk about these other things, except to say that there's a huge divide about the global kinds of mental disorders, even genetically, between neurosis and those who care too much about what other people think, and externalizing things about people who care too little. And neither of these extreme strategies works very well. There's continuing controversy about this. For those interested, there's a very heavy-duty book published last year by Koos Boomsma, an insect biologist, that really lays out all of this with its history beautifully. So this is a missing foundation for understanding relationships and why they're conflictual, and how psychotherapy can be helpful. As for the future of our field, it's the missing half of a fully biological psychiatry that's based on medicine, a way to understand individuals as individuals, a way to consider all treatments instead of getting stuck on one, and basically it just makes sense out of mental disorders. There are more resources. We're only at the dawn of this field, already useful, lots more work is needed, and maybe some of you will join us at our meeting in August. It's going to be a wonderful meeting. I can't wait to get over there and see everyone. Thank you so much. I think I'll stop the sharing now and look forward to conversation with you all.
Well, Randy, that was fantastic. We could have had another hour of that, but unfortunately, our time's limited. A really interesting talk about the application of these ideas to fields which are very important, psychiatry and medicine in particular. And I found it extremely illuminating. Brian, you had a question, yeah? Brian Smith.
Yes, I do. Yes.
We could ask people to turn on their cameras, and then it'd be fun to see everybody.
Yeah.
Okay, just to so related to something else I was reading recently, Randy. I don't know if are you familiar with Jonathan Haidt's work about he wrote The Coddling of the American Mind and this stuff
Yes,
about
right.
Yeah. And his current crusade, it's probably the right word for it, is about limiting children's access to mobile phones and social media because of its impact on their mental health. Do you have a view on that? Do you think he's right, or?
I admire him enormously. It's fascinating, the social storm that surrounds this. There was a very critical review in Nature by someone who studied that, saying, well, it's not so short at all. And bless Jonathan Haidt, he came back with the most measured, thoughtful, sensible response on Twitter of saying, well, actually, let's look at what you're saying. And it was that's the way discussions should be conducted instead of just one way. I've been uncertain about this, and I'm often asked about it. I think the data in the UK from a few years ago that I'm familiar with does indeed show that young women are having increased rates of problems, possibly because of social media. Their social comparison theory, is fundamental to this. We all assess ourselves, and now instead of real people, we're assessing ourselves in regards to people's imagined presentations about their ideal selves on Facebook, and now even artificially generated individuals. So it is entirely plausible to me that our world can be wrecked by comparing ourselves to others. On the other hand, you don't even need fancy social media. You just need to watch television and see everybody so brilliant and attractive and rich, and we're not. None of us are. In fact, even those people aren't. So a wonderful area for continuing research and relevant to all of this.
Anybody else? I see no raised hands yet.
Well, I have another question, Jeff. If
Yes,
there's
please,
nobody, okay. I've got loads actually. I've read a lot of Andy's work, and it fascinates me. I was interested in the section of your talk, Randy, about signal detection theory, because it's an area of work that I'm involved in to do with in vitro diagnostics in medicine. And I just wanted to check my understanding. I think what you're saying is that in cases of anxiety disorders, that it's essentially a problem of having the threshold set at in the wrong place. And presumably what you're saying is that means that therapies are about shifting the threshold to have less false alarms. Is that what you're saying, or have I misunderstood?
That's a lovely summary. I wish you could give lectures to psychiatrists summarizing all of that. I think that's exactly what we're up to, and the relevance to other disorders and medical treatments, I think, is equally important. So I see several people on the call here whose comments I would really appreciate. And I see Mark is here, Mark Van Goot. Mark's work has shown that people compete to be viewed as altruists. And I think that fits in quite well with what I've been saying. And I think it also may be important to bring that whole perspective into trying to understand some of the emotional problems people have. And do you want to say anything about that, Mark? Don't want to put you on the spot exactly, but...
Mark? No. Robin's got his hand up. Robin, would you like to say something?
Give Robin the floor. He can answer it too.
I think you're on, Mark. Why don't you go ahead first?
You go.
Well,
Yeah,
no, give Robin the floor, but we can't hear him. Robin, we can't hear you.
All I'm doing is filling the time while you think, Mark. Okay, let me just ask or make a comment really rather than ask a question of Randy. It does seem to me increasingly over the last decade maybe that one of the problems generically we have in the psychological sciences, and I guess this underpins the approach in psychiatry to some extent, to the medical side of psychiatry anyway, is that psychologists tend to view the world in a very asocial sort of way. It's all about you and your personality traits, or what you do in response to some stimulus, as though in a kind of mechanistic kind of way. And the nearest they ever get to viewing a social world is you and your baby, or you and your romantic partner, and maybe if you're lucky, you and your mother or father. That's the sum total, and somehow in that mix, and to some extent this has also been true of the post sociobiology selfish gene move, which I think unquestionably was highly necessary, but it kind of shifted the view away from the fact that actually most...
We lost you there. At least I can't hear.
Lost you, Robin. Yeah. Okay, Mark, do you want to come in? Robin can come back.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so Randy, I've recently written a paper on the digital work.
My line is dreadful. It keeps dropping out. Either that, or Mark is sort of turning some higher button in Holland there.
No conspiracy theories here, please.
Anyway, the point I was making is simply that, you know, I think we kind of need to kind of review again the organism within kind of networks and communities to really understand a lot of why and what actually goes on in the individual, as it were. Seeing the individual as part of a community is going to become really important for progress, put it that way.
Thank you.
So this is so I've actually wondered, Robin, if psychotherapy might be part of the problem with increasing rates of disorders and the like, because it essentially says you're feeling bad, let's help you feel better. How can you reach your goals better? How can you triumph over others? How, you know, it's not always that way. It also has the expectation usually in psychotherapy that normal relationships are loving, mutual, and fully cooperative. And that's also not true. So everybody feels bad about themselves. And if they're sensible, first they feel guilty and then they feel smug for getting over their guilt. It's just a terrible, I mean, psychotherapy is so helpful and so profoundly useful, but it's all individualized. Yes, people do family therapy and marital therapy and the like, but very few look at the cultural roles of all of this. Shinru Kitayama is my colleague, and Richard Nisbet do cultural psychology, of course. And here's the fact I think is overwhelmingly neglected. Rates of depression in Korea and Japan are 1/8 of those in the USA. If we could get rates down to those, it would do more good than all the treatment we're doing. There's something different about these cultures. Maybe it's partly diet and exercise, maybe even genes to some extent, but something's different. And I think what's different is people are meshed in networks that hold and sustain them instead of constantly being dragged down and moving to different cities where they don't know anybody and they're supposed to live a happy life. You know, I think, and nobody wants to spend, I mean, we're spending $4 billion a year on mental health research, and nobody is trying to understand why certain cultures have vastly higher and lower depression rates than others. And hardly anybody, even in psychiatry, is trying to understand the social networks in which people are enmeshed. I mean, companies are trying to reduce depression rates, right? But they're not doing it by stopping their thing of asking people each week to fill out their performance ratings of themselves and everybody around them. You know, so I think that I don't know what we do about this though, because incentives are for individuals, at least around here.
Can I ask you a related question about complementary conditions? I mean, I have no psychiatric training, so I'm getting stuff from management literature and places like that. For example, there's a literature in management about team building and team cohesiveness. And one of the arguments that comes up is that someone who may be describable as autistic, I know the problem with that label, but something like that, which has obsessional traits and so on. I'm not saying they're diseases, but maybe complementary with others who have a different mental mindset. And as a team, the so-called autistic person can play an important role, being complementary to traits that others have. So in fact, a variety of conditions maybe have an evolutionary advantage for groups, insofar as groups are objects of selection. You've touched on that, but that's a complicated issue, but it's something we talk about. What's your attitude to that? I mean, is there insufficient?
This is a welcome question. This is a welcome question, and I've spent several months delving into it, the basic evolutionary biology of it. I mean, it is certainly true that groups with members with certain special skills can benefit. Absolutely. The question is, can those benefits to the group lead to selection for individuals with those special quirks? And the answer is no, they can't. What we're talking about really is morphs, biological morphs, and those can exist. For instance, in bluegill sunfish, there are 3 different mating morphs, and these can be coded for genetically. But it only works if each morph has identical fitness over the long run, and there's frequency-dependent selection so that they become more common as the rate becomes lower for that particular morph. So I think this idea does not work. as an explanation for specific variations in human personality. On the other hand, this is a rich area of research because human social groups have all these different niches. I came of age when we were all doing tea groups, and so I participated in lots of groups, and it's fascinating to be in a tea group. And there's always somebody who wants to be the party person, other person wants to be the big boss, another person who wants to be second to the big boss, and somebody else who wants to not have. There are all these social roles that kind of emerge in groups pretty reliably, and that's been going on for a long, long time for a species that can talk. Has that in Jungian ideas created these different subtypes of individuals? I don't think it can create genetically different subtypes. It could easily create facultatively different subtypes that are ready to emerge in response to those kinds of situations. But then we see the reality that these different personality types are highly heritable. This is a really rich area that has not benefited from the input of sophisticated theoretical evolutionary biology the way it should. But it's ready.
Thank you.
Great question.
Mark, you got your hand up. Do you want to come in?
Yes, well, so one of the things I'm trying to do is to bring an evolutionary perspective to the workplace. We've been doing some work recently, funded by the Europe Horizon on mental health in the workplace. I mean, there are two trends I think that are quite significant, and I'd like to hear your opinion about that. One is indeed an increased prevalence of all kinds of mental health problems in the workplace, from depression, burnout, low mood, leading to turnover, etc. And the other is the increased digitalization of the workplace. And so with digitalization, I mean working remotely via computers, but also working online, working in offices where the contact with your colleagues is done via email mostly. And so, I mean, what are your views on this? Do you think that these trends may be somehow connected? I'm particularly interested in this sort of mismatch perspective on this, where you say, well, digital work is really fundamentally different from the way our ancestors worked for, well, thousands of generations, and that causes all kinds of problems leading to these mental health problems. What is your view on this, Randy?
So I don't know that much about it, Mark. People like you are advancing the frontier for this. We all recognize that things are very different, making things better for some people. There's a lot of shy people who can lurk on a Zoom meeting and contribute in appropriate ways who really couldn't otherwise. I mean, it is so fundamentally different. I mean, trying to keep run reins on a workforce. I mean, the Slack channel apparently at Google has created huge problems because in places where people can say what they actually think instead of being restrained by sitting around a table with the boss listening to what they say and being able to respond, they say what they really think sometimes and create havoc. And then the bosses try to rein it in, and they're faced with this problem of what are our rules of engagement, and on and on and on and on. There's something else about groups, though, that the workplace that I think is fascinating, and Ulrika might have something to say about this as well. All kinds of bosses are very big into getting people to cooperate. And they put lots of effort into team building and helping everybody realize that they really should be working for the good of the organization. And Elon Musk says he only wants people in his organization who are willing to live at the office for 7 days in a row, right? That kind of stuff. Because you care, only because you care, not because of the money, but just because you care and you're passionate. Well, that all sounds really good. But a lot of this seems obvious to me to be elites using ideas to manipulate those who are subservient to them. And and some group selection ideas likewise. You should really do it for the good of the group because that's natural and a good way, and be a good person, do what's good for the group. That's fine if you're the leader. Leaders are always trying to manipulate their underlings to do what's good for the group. on the other hand, it is good for everybody if everybody cooperates and does what's good for the group. And poor deans, can you imagine being a dean or a president of university these days? I assume it's the same in the UK, where you have to say stuff for and against something or another, but as soon as you do, half of the people start trying to call for your ouster. It's just an impossible kind of situation because we've never before had the opportunity to create influence groups, in groups and out groups instantly, the way we. And on top of all this, one other thing that I love what people. I think true confidentiality was never possible. In human groups, there was never confidentiality until really Freud. You could say something to the priest and hope he didn't tell anybody. In fact, that was part of the special role of priests, is somebody who would provide confidentiality. But in human social groups throughout, thousands of years, you said something and people spread the gossip like Robin talks about. And that information spreading was crucial to social cohesion and discohesion and in-groups and out-groups and relationships, all the rest. Now, people can anonymously make accusations and ruin somebody's job, really? Or they can tell their secret sexual fantasies to a web group where they never are found out, and all kinds of wild things get acceptable. As you say, it's a wild new world, and I don't think we know where it. Do you want to comment on that, Mark?
Well, one thing I picked up from this, which I'm already thinking, is that we have departed significantly from optimal foraging theory in the way we work and appreciate work. I think that must be it. And maybe there is some rebalancing or recalibrating going on, maybe because of the COVID, some sort of disaster that struck, where we're re-evaluating our relationship with work, with our bosses, etc.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So I have Alika, are you there? Are you able to speak? I'm not sure if you're in a car or anything, but you'd have a special perspective on one question I have. So I'll just say it anyway. Oh, good. I'd love to see your face to turn on your camera if you're there. This whole business of trying to talk about levels of selection and group selection and selfish genes and stuff to psychiatrists and psychologists, I think it could be very problematic. One person that I've talked with recently, who's a very sophisticated emotions researcher, has said, well, one good thing, if you know evolution, in any therapy session, you can tell patients that, at least if things are going badly, that everybody's selfish, so it's not just you. What? And these are very sophisticated, smart people saying such things. And there's somebody on Twitter also who is, I think is handled as life is shit and it's worse than that or something like that. But he's basically taken the meme of, selfish gene makes selfish people and therefore we're all selfish and it's all hopeless. I think people's view of human nature is very important. Yeah. And I think there are memes that are spreading, and I don't know if it's even responsible to be talking about this kind of stuff because we're all simplistic thinkers. And where do you think all this stands, Ulrich? I'd be very curious about your take.
Well, I was very shocked actually to hear from you that this thing is going on. That you said actually in your talk that people are talking about selfishness and selfish genes. I think this is such old hat. Where has this now popped up from? Old hat to make this connection, and everybody knows that you shouldn't do that. So why do people feel authorized to do that?
Most people, in clinical circles, they've kind of heard about the word sociobiology and they know it's bad. That's one thing. And most people I talk to about, selection working at the level of the gene, they think, well, that's a bad idea. They really don't know anything about it, Ulrika. Yeah. And a little bit, I think, can create big misconceptions. Or should we go for it and try to help them understand the social context of human emotions? I don't know.
Some of it may come from economics and people around economics. We've discussed this issue before. Take a non-economist like Ayn Rand, who, for some weird reason, has become extremely popular, particularly in the US, but also in the UK. And she preaches anti-altruism, and ultra selfishness. I mean, there's no evolutionary argument to support what she says, but she's incredibly influential. And economists also, certain types of economists have legitimated a view of ultra selfishness. And it unfortunately pervades politics now in the US and the UK and other countries. And this is partly an ideological thing. I think it's partly the decline of traditional authority, decline of religion. I'm not religious myself, but I'm talking about a crisis of belief, a crisis of identity for people, and on how we and how societies cohere. They need to cohere by some way. Used to be religion. We've not yet found a good way of cohering. So it's not just Richard Dawkins. I mean, he's not all responsible for this, but it is. I think it's an ideological issue as well.
Yeah.
I think, Job, that was very well put. I think it is connected exactly to this economic quote unquote selfishness, which is kind of allowed or even supported. Yeah. And I think this is just a way of talking. I don't think it has anything to do with legitimation or with selfish gene. I think it's just some stupid way of talking.
That's right. Yeah. I've got a quick. I've got so many questions for Randy. I don't want to hog this. I've got another question. I want to get the terminology right. I'm aware of the problem of labeling. I think it's called in the American Psychiatric Association manual. I think it's called antisocial personality disorder. Okay, and it has different types, sometimes called sociopaths or alternatively psychopaths. Now, one feature, I mean, this again comes out of management, and the argument goes like this, and tell me if it's wrong, because I'm not particularly betrothed to it, but the argument is that some of these people of this ilk with this condition are very, very adept at socializing, hiding their true feelings, but being sociable to others, and they actually elevate themselves in organizations, including in politics. And one of their key traits is a lack of shame or moral feeling, although they come across very often as very sociable, nice people, caring, they come across in that way, but actually they lack guilt, they lack feelings of moral purpose and so on. And these people get into organizations and also politics. I could name a few examples. One begins with Boris. The evolutionary argument is that there's a question in that literature about why these people, why these traits survive, which are partly possibly genetic. And one is actually they have no moral qualms about promiscuity. So that's a possible explanation added on to explain why the genetic disposition to do this way is there. Is that a load of tosh, Randy, or is there something in that?
So this is a topic that's been widely discussed, and it was Linda Mealy actually who got all this going with an article in Behavioral and Brain Sciences, I think in the late 80s or early 90s. And it was a lovely article because she made a specific hypothesis that these are frequency dependent traits, and when they're rare, you can take over because everybody's a sucker. And when they become more common, everybody becomes more skeptical and suspicious, and therefore they don't work as well, and therefore they're maintained at a certain low rate. So I've delved into this literature some, and so how do you test that? Well, one way is to consider alternative explanations, and an alternative is that there's something wrong with these people. They have brain damage and the like. And it turns out that there's a lot of literature showing that many of them have minor neurological signs. Little reflexes that aren't right, and other things that aren't quite right with their brains, and that they were more likely to have damage at the time of birth. But it's so much of the science is so hard to do, though, because then you look up further articles and they say, well, actually, re-examining that literature, that's probably not true. Another question is, how heritable is that trait? It's very heritable. But is it actually distinct so that there is a subtype that is sociopathy that's discrete and separate by itself, or is it a continuum? Uncertain. Certainly, I've seen some individuals who are sociopaths. There's no real effective treatment that I know about. Prisons, by the way, a lot of the people in prisons are not sociopaths. They're just people who are doing illegal things to try to get money, sex, and other kinds of things. But these are very peculiar people. And sometimes in your role, you see them at the head of the corporation, wheeling and dealing and manipulating. I know in one group work group I was in, I finally realized that I could completely predict what the leader was going to do. It was whatever was in his self-interest. There was, there's a lot of talk about good for the group, but once I realized that I could completely predict what this person could do, I could deal with the person a lot more readily instead of trying to reason and convince and create a relationship to influence that person. So I assume this is a big problem for management because you want people who are effective at influencing other people, but you'd rather that they didn't do it in nasty, sneaky ways, except that often does work. What do you think?
Yeah, well, I read there was a genetic marker as well, but that may be wrong. I don't know. On that.
Not a specific one, but thousands of
Okay.
genes that influence this trait like every other one.
Okay. Well, let's. I'm ashamed to do so, but let's wrap this up. I want to thank you immensely, Randy, for this talk. It's been very stimulating. It's brought together a lot of the threads that we've discussed in our group in the past, and it's great to see this directed and applied at something which is very important, which is mental health in particular and medicine more broadly. It's extremely. One gets a feeling of the value of what we're doing, rather than talking about abstract ideas. We're actually pioneering or trying to push forward answers to very real problems in the world, and that's great and fantastic. And thanks very much for your contribution, on behalf of everyone. And thank you.
Thanks for the invitation, and thanks for everybody for being here. I'd love to hear from anybody who has other comments via email or the like. I wish I could be back in London with you for a while to have a chat, but do come to our meeting in Durham if you want to. We're going to have a great time.
Durham's a great city. If you've never been there, it's a fantastic place. Okay, thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thanks a lot.